John F. Kennedy Jr.'s fatal flight ended in the waters only 17 miles from Martha's Vineyard. Even after 20 years, clarity on what actually happened remains elusive. Amid intense examination, numerous inaccuracies emerged from widespread speculation and misinterpretation of the events. Was John an incompetent pilot? Did he lack proper training? Was he simply reckless? The answers to all these questions are negative. John F. Kennedy Jr. was the son of one of America's most iconic presidents, and his life was under constant public scrutiny. His tragic death in 1999, along with his wife Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy and sister-in-law Lauren Bessette, became a defining moment in aviation history. The story of John F. Kennedy Jr.'s final flight is one that involves not just the pilot and his passengers, but also the intricate web of circumstances and challenges that led to their tragic fate. This is the tragic story of John F. Kennedy Jr.'s final flight. On July 16, 1999, John Kennedy Jr. embarked on a flight from Essex County Airport in Caldwell, New Jersey, destined for Martha's Vineyard. Although the weather forecast listed clear skies at cruising altitudes, ground-level haze along the coast created significant challenges for visual flight, with visibility dropping to as low as 4 miles in some areas. Experienced pilots reported difficulty maintaining visual contact with the horizon during similar flights that night. The weather conditions would ultimately contribute to a fatal situation for John, who was not certified for instrument-only navigation, making the flight riskier than a daytime trip. John F. Kennedy Jr. was a relatively new pilot, having earned his private pilot's license just 15 months before the crash. He had accumulated around 310 flight hours, with approximately 55 of those at night. However, John had yet to complete his instrument rating, a crucial certification that allows a pilot to navigate solely by instruments in conditions where the horizon isn't visible. While he had demonstrated caution and sought out advanced training, his experience in night flying, particularly over water, was limited. This made the conditions that evening far more demanding than a typical flight. John departed Caldwell at 8:34 p.m. The initial stages of the flight were uneventful. He picked up his sister-in-law, Lauren, at 7 p.m., and they reached the airport at 8 p.m. After Carolyn's arrival at 8:20 p.m. They were set to depart. John began his flight from Caldwell, climbing to an altitude of 5,500 feet, before setting a course to Martha's Vineyard, following the Hudson River and climbing to avoid restricted airspace. The route took the aircraft over the Long Island Sound, a stretch of water between New York and Connecticut. This part of the flight was critical, as flying over water at night can create what is known as a black hole effect, where the lack of visual references can disorient a pilot. Even experienced pilots find such conditions challenging, and for John, who was still relatively inexperienced, it added significant difficulty. The haze reported along the route only compounded these challenges, making it difficult for John to maintain visual references to the horizon. John encountered hazy conditions soon after departure, and delays caused them to take off much later than planned, well after sunset. These circumstances placed him in challenging flying conditions for a pilot with limited night experience, increasing his reliance on instruments rather than visual cues. The haze made it difficult to see the horizon, which is crucial for maintaining spatial orientation. As the flight progressed, John found himself flying in an environment devoid of visible landmarks. The sea and sky blended into one, creating a situation where visual orientation was nearly impossible. Under these conditions, the pilot's inner ear can send conflicting signals to the brain, leading to a phenomenon known as spatial disorientation. Spatial disorientation is a condition where a pilot loses the ability to correctly interpret the aircraft's attitude, altitude, or speed, and it is one of the leading causes of nighttime and poor weather aviation accidents. Flying at night without visual references can lead to spatial disorientation. The conditions were ripe for this phenomenon, particularly for a pilot without an instrument rating. The autopilot, if disengaged unintentionally, could also complicate control as the workload increased in poor visibility. When spatial disorientation sets in, a pilot can become convinced that the aircraft is in a stable position when in reality it is banking or descending. Without the proper training and reliance on instruments, correcting these misconceptions becomes incredibly difficult. John may have initially relied on his autopilot to manage parts of the flight. The autopilot, when correctly engaged, helps in maintaining the aircraft's heading and altitude, significantly reducing the pilot's workload, particularly in conditions with limited visibility. However, at some point, the autopilot was likely disengaged, whether intentionally or by mistake, and John was left to manually control the aircraft in very challenging conditions. The transition from autopilot to manual control, particularly without clear visual references, can be disorienting even for experienced pilots. Another possibility is that John's unfamiliarity with the more advanced Saratoga played a role. The Saratoga, while a capable aircraft, demanded more of its pilot than the Cessna he was accustomed to flying. Managing power settings, trim adjustments, and navigation simultaneously requires a high level of proficiency, especially in low visibility conditions. Approaching Martha's Vineyard, John started his descent. Due to darkness and haze, external visual references were few, making it nearly impossible to distinguish the horizon. His mistuned radio frequency meant he was unable to receive the ATIS broadcast, possibly distracting him during this critical phase. Without realizing, the aircraft began to bank right, a sign that spatial disorientation was setting in. John's attention may have been diverted by his efforts to locate the correct radio frequency, a seemingly small but crucial task that took his focus away from controlling the aircraft. In night flying, especially over featureless terrain like open water, even a brief distraction can lead to a loss of control. The aircraft's gradual right bank went unnoticed, and by the time John realized the aircraft was not level, the situation had already escalated. Spatial disorientation often leads to what is called a graveyard spiral. In this scenario, a pilot, believing the aircraft is in level flight, attempts to correct what feels like a turn by pulling back on the controls, which actually tightens the spiral and increases the descent rate. The instruments, which could have helped John identify and correct this error, were either not trusted or not interpreted correctly due to his level of training and the disorienting conditions. John corrected the right bank momentarily, but continued his descent with increasing speed. The lack of visual cues and the mistaken autopilot engagement led to a chain of disoriented maneuvers. John's attempts to stabilize the flight became frantic as he struggled against misleading sensations from spatial disorientation. The darkness, combined with the lack of visible horizon and the constant need to refer to the instruments, made the recovery even more challenging. At some point, John likely realized that the aircraft was in an unusual attitude. The altimeter and vertical speed indicator would have shown a rapid descent, while the artificial horizon would have displayed a steep bank. To recover, John needed to trust his instruments entirely, but this is easier said than done. Spatial disorientation causes a pilot's senses to contradict the instruments, leading to confusion and delayed reactions. John's actions, adding power, pulling back on the controls, and trying to level the wings, were all efforts to regain control, but the increasing speed and bank angle made these efforts futile. Carolyn and Lauren, unaware of the unfolding crisis in the cockpit, likely experienced fear and confusion as the plane's movements grew erratic, especially with sudden altitude changes and sharp banking turns. They would have felt the steep banking of the aircraft, the rapid changes in altitude, and the increased G-forces as John struggled to bring the aircraft under control. The cabin, lit by the dim glow of the instrument panel, would have felt increasingly claustrophobic as the situation worsened. The noise of the engine increasing in pitch as John added power, combined with the disorienting movements of the aircraft, would have added to the terror of those final moments. It is likely that neither Carolyn nor Lauren understood the full gravity of what was happening, but the erratic flight path and sudden changes in direction and altitude would have indicated that something had gone terribly wrong. In the final moments, John made a critical decision to increase the throttle in an attempt to regain control. Unfortunately, the combination of a steep bank and spatial disorientation resulted in a deadly spiral towards the ocean. The decision to add power was likely an instinctive response to what he perceived as a loss of altitude. But without leveling the wings first, the added power only accelerated the descent. John's inability to correct the right bank and stabilize the descent was a direct result of the spatial disorientation he was experiencing. The increasing speed only made the situation more difficult to manage, as the aircraft's controls became more sensitive and required greater precision to stabilize. The rapid descent, combined with the steep bank angle, ultimately led to the aircraft entering a spiral dive, from which recovery was no longer possible, given the altitude remaining. The aircraft plunged into the Atlantic at a speed of 250 knots, inverting upon impact. John, Carolyn, and Lauren perished instantly. The tragedy unfolded over a dark, featureless sea, making recovery virtually impossible in those conditions. The force of the impact was so great that it left little chance for survival. The aircraft, traveling at such a high speed, disintegrated upon hitting the water, and the occupants were killed instantly by the forces involved. The final moments of the flight would have been chaotic and terrifying. The rapid descent, combined with the steep banking and increasing speed, would have created a feeling of weightlessness, followed by intense G-forces as the aircraft spiraled downward. The darkness outside, the noise of the engines, and the confusion in the cockpit would have made these final seconds disorienting and frightening for everyone on board. There were no survivors. The crash prompted an extensive search and rescue operation involving the Coast Guard, Navy, and other local authorities. The search efforts were initially hampered by the challenging conditions: darkness, deep waters, and the scattered wreckage. It took several days to locate the aircraft, which was eventually found on the ocean floor. The wreckage was located using sonar and remote-operated vehicles, and all 3 bodies were recovered from the ocean floor, bringing an end to the nation's collective hopes for a miracle. The news of the crash and the subsequent search dominated headlines for days. The loss of John F. Kennedy Jr., often seen as the heir to the Kennedy legacy, struck a deep chord with the American public. The images of the Coast Guard ships, helicopters, and divers searching the waters off Martha's Vineyard became a constant presence on television, underscoring the gravity of the tragedy. The NTSB attributed the crash to John's inability to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, exacerbated by spatial disorientation. They noted contributing factors including the pilot's inexperience in instrument flight conditions and the challenging weather. The investigation revealed that John was not adequately prepared for the conditions he faced, particularly the combination of night, flying over water, and haze, which eliminated any visual reference to the horizon. The report also highlighted the importance of instrument training and the risks associated with overconfidence in one's abilities as a pilot. While John had considerable experience for a relatively new pilot, he lacked the specific skills needed to handle the conditions that led to the crash. The investigation stressed that even pilots with substantial flight hours can fall victim to spatial disorientation if they are not properly trained to rely on their instruments when visual cues are absent. This incident brought to light the dangers of spatial disorientation for non-instrument rated pilots flying at night. It highlighted the need for additional training and stricter guidelines for night flights over featureless terrain or water. The aviation industry took notice of the circumstances surrounding the crash, and there was a renewed emphasis on the importance of instrument training for private pilots. The tragedy served as a stark reminder that even experienced pilots are vulnerable if they are not adequately trained for the conditions they face. Pilot training programs began placing greater emphasis on the risks of night flying and spatial disorientation. There were calls for increased awareness among pilots about the dangers of flying over water at night without an instrument rating, and some flight schools introduced additional modules specifically focused on these risks. The FAA also issued guidance to flight instructors, encouraging them to better prepare their students for the challenges of night flying and to emphasize the importance of always being prepared to fly by instruments if necessary. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.